Welcome to The Debate. Today we are unpacking, well, what is undoubtedly the most significant geopolitical event of the new year. The stunning, kinetic conclusion to what was already 2 decades of deeply antagonistic conflict between the United States and Venezuela. We are talking, of course, about the military operation executed on January 3rd, 2026, culminating in the capture of Nicolas Maduro. This was not a minor political incident. I mean, the capture of a sitting head of state is a monumental strategic shift.
Indeed, it marks a profound and, in my view, a very premature departure from the established tactics of sustained economic warfare and, calibrated diplomacy that had defined this complex conflict for nearly a decade.
So our central question today is framed by the history that led us to that very moment. We have to determine, was this final act of direct military intervention, the capture of Maduro, the inevitable and, frankly, strategically necessary culmination of 2 decades of escalating U.S. pressure?
Or was it a counterproductive and unnecessary deviation from the economic and diplomatic tactics that had already demonstrably crippled the Venezuelan regime?
And my position is that the existing framework of sustained pressure, this economic asphyxiation, it provided a less risky and ultimately a more viable path forward to achieve the necessary political transition. The military option was strategically superfluous and it massively increased instability. And I'll be arguing that military action became necessary precisely because diplomacy and economic pressure, though brutally severe, had exhausted their utility. They reached their limits without achieving the vital U.S. security and foreign policy objectives, forcing, in the end, a kinetic solution. When we review the history of this confrontation, the pattern of resistance to non-military pressure, it's crystal clear. The tension has existed since Hugo Chávez's rise in 1998 and his subsequent alignment with U.S. adversaries, notably Cuba, Iran, Russia, and China. Even the tensions around the 2002 coup attempt, which Washington publicly applauded, demonstrated the foundational hostility of the regime. The U.S. response evolved, culminating in the maximum pressure campaign between 2017 and 2020. We saw the total oil embargo imposed in 2019, a crushing blow to the nation's single revenue source, and the formal recognition of Juan Guaidó as the legitimate interim president.
But you call this a failure?
It failed to achieve regime change or compel a democratic transition. The source material reveals that Maduro simply entrenched himself. He barricaded his political position through reliance on those foreign allies and, critically, by doubling down on the military and intelligence apparatus he already controlled. The economic pain generated misery for the populace, yes, but it did not generate compliance from the leadership. And by March 2020, the confrontation fundamentally shifted. It moved from being purely political or economic to a direct, formal security threat. And this is evidenced by the U.S. Department of Justice formally accusing Maduro and other high-ranking officials of directing a narco-terrorism cartel. I mean, the U.S. didn't just sanction the regime's banks. They put a $15 million reward on the head of its leader. The final decisive action in January 2026 was therefore necessary to eliminate a regime that had merged its political survival with organized criminal activity. The intelligence confirmed the regime's reliance on these organizations, which were cited as key conduits for narco-terrorism routes destined for the U.S. Decisive, kinetic action was the only remaining path to sever that link and break the political stalemate.
I approach this from a completely different perspective. The advocates' framing, I think, dismisses the sheer strategic effectiveness of the sustained economic pressure that was already in place. The 2019 total oil embargo on PDVSA of Venezuela State Oil Company and the complex sanctions layered onto the Venezuelan central bank had already effectively asphyxiated the regime's finances. Hyperinflation was rampant, and the state's capacity to govern or maintain even basic infrastructure was just disintegrating.
But disintegration is not transition.
No, but disintegration leads to internal fracturing. This was a sophisticated, calibrated strategy. You have to consider the limited diplomatic channels established by the Biden administration in 2021 and 2022, spurred partially by the global energy crisis following the Ukraine war. Washington selectively allowed U.S. firms like Chevron to partially reauthorize operations to extract and export Venezuelan crude, and that was combined with successful prisoner swaps. These small, conditional gestures showed that pressure could be selectively eased or tightened to encourage concrete political movements, such as, participation in free elections. This strategic flexibility, the ability to regulate the flow of money and maintain a sense of leverage, was a far more sophisticated tool than immediate brute force military deployment. The shift from economic throttling to the massive military buildup in August 2025, 4,000 troops, 8 warships, specialized P-8 maritime surveillance aircraft, and then the subsequent strike. It unnecessarily escalated the conflict. It violated national sovereignty, and as Maduro successfully argued during the country's mass counter-mobilization, Operation Independencia 200, it gave him a narrative of heroic resistance against a foreign invasion. The regime was already severely weakened by sanctions. The military option introduces high, unpredictable risks of regional instability without guaranteeing the collapse of the Chavista political and military infrastructure itself.
Okay, so I see why you characterize the situation as a stalemate that required decisive action, but let's look at the actual leverage involved here.
Wasn't a total oil embargo combined with the freezing of overseas assets like Citgo, the massive US-based refining arm of PDVSA, wasn't that already the economic nuclear option? What substantive strategic goal related to national security did the military capture achieve that the continuous crippling economic collapse, which was already underway, could not have accomplished over time? We were starving them of capital. Why abandon that slow, certain death for a high-risk, immediate assault?
That's an interesting point about the threshold of economic pain, but I think that view misses a critical development in the regime's structure. Economic collapse alone, as we saw between 2019 and 2025, it merely taught the regime how to survive without legal oil revenue. They didn't capitulate, they adapted by relying even more deeply on external state allies, like the technical assistance from Russia and China, and critically, on internal criminal organizations. They transformed into a self-financing narco-state. Sanctions are excellent at targeting financial systems and legitimacy, but kinetic action is required to target command and control. The capture wasn't about seizing bank accounts, it was about surgically removing the head of the criminal cartel that had fused itself with the political structure. Intelligence indicated the regime's reliance on narco-terrorism for survival was absolute. You can sanction a regime indefinitely, but you have to dismantle a cartel physically. This realization that the political apparatus was the security threat, that's what fundamentally changed the calculus, necessitating the massive 2025 military deployment and the subsequent kinetic response. The economic failure was that it failed to compel them to bargain in good faith. It simply drove them into a more dangerous criminal business model.
But surgery on that scale risked sending off a regional chain reaction, and it guaranteed the immediate loss of the strongest leverage the U.S. possessed, the promise of sanctions relief.
I'm just not convinced by the continued faith in those diplomatic openings. Let's look at the tangible results. The small diplomatic channels you highlighted, the Chevron deal, the Norway talks, they were entirely contingent on the promise of holding free and fair elections. And what was Maduro's response? He exploited the openings for temporary sanctions relief and then proclaimed victory without presenting a single verifiable proof in the 2024 elections. Doesn't the utter failure of these talks to yield meaningful, democratic concessions confirm that Maduro had zero intention of yielding power, thereby proving that the diplomatic path was a dead end he only utilized for temporary tactical advantage? Maintaining that channel, in that context, became strategically detrimental rather than beneficial.
That's a compelling argument regarding Maduro's duplicity and tactical exploitation, but have you considered the geopolitical utility of keeping a channel open, even if it's a cynical one? Those diplomatic efforts, even when they resulted in broken promises, they kept the conversation alive, and most crucially, they avoided the creation of a massive immediate security crisis, like the one we saw in January 2026. The U.S. still had substantial leverage left to deploy without kinetic risk. For instance, Washington had demonstrated its ability to maintain calibrated, painful pressure by tightening sanctions, seizing oil tankers transporting Venezuelan crude, and prosecuting associates. These are all actions taken prior to the strike. We could have intensified that pressure, leveraging the promise of full oil market re-entry, which the desperate economy desperately needed, against verifiable, monitored steps toward political plurality. We swapped slow, certain agony for the high-stakes, violent uncertainty of a military strike. The risk-reward ratio of sustained economic pressure was just significantly better than the ratio of the kinetic intervention. I want to challenge you on the issue of justification. I come at it from a different way regarding the official rationale. The stated reason for the massive August 2025 military buildup was specifically anti-narco-trafficking operations, emphasizing border security and interdiction. Yet the final January strike captured the political leader Nicolas Maduro and his wife, a classic regime change objective. Given the U.S. history of openly seeking regime change, dating back to the applause for the 2002 coup and President Trump's explicit 2017 goal, wasn't the narco-terrorism justification simply a necessary political cover? It allowed Washington to frame a long-sought foreign policy goal, regime removal, as a response to a transnational organized crime threat, which carries far more international legal weight.
Right, that's a fair point regarding historical precedent, but the formal charges and the $15 million bounty issued by the Department of Justice against a sitting head of state were unprecedented precisely because they were backed by credible, actionable intelligence regarding the government's direct participation in criminal enterprises. So, regardless of underlying historical regime change desires, which certainly informed policy, the government's direct involvement in organized crime routes terminating in the U.S. provided a legitimate, a necessary, and a legally justifiable catalyst for the final military response in January 2026. This wasn't merely a political intervention thinly disguised, it was a required intervention against a specific, escalating security threat that had metastasized within the political apparatus. By the time of the strike, dismantling the cartel was regime change. The two objectives had become synonymous. Now let me challenge you on the final objective, which was to enable a democratic transition. If Maduro remained in power, the military command structure remained loyal, and the transition path was completely blocked. We know that in the weeks preceding the strike, the groundwork for transition was being laid, evidenced by the U.S. secret operation to extract the key opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado. Doesn't the removal of Maduro offer the critical, immediate window for key elements of the Venezuelan military and intelligence services to finally break ranks and accept the transition? This is a move they would never risk while he was still physically in power and controlling the command hierarchy.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the military will automatically shatter simply because the figurehead has been removed. Let me tell you why. The history of the Chavista regime shows its deep ideological and institutional resilience. The fact that the source material immediately raises the critical question of whether the regime can survive under the control of deeply entrenched and powerful figures suggests the core apparatus remains frighteningly intact. We are talking about key players like Vice President Delis Rodriguez, who is the powerful head of intelligence and the system's chief pragmatist, Minister of Defense Vladimir Padrino, who commands the armed forces, and Diosdado Cabello, the ideological guardian and political muscle of the Chavista movement. Military intervention removed the figurehead, yes, but it did so in the most violent and polarizing manner possible. This polarization may actually serve to unify the remnants of the regime, forcing them to circle the wagons and become more rigid and resistant to internal fracturing than if economic asphyxiation had been allowed to continue its slow, corrosive work. That gradual erosion might have created the conditions for an internal schism, a split between the pragmatic and ideological factions, which is now far less likely given the unifying threat of external force.
In summation, the military operation in January 2026 was the necessary final stroke. We had years of accumulating evidence that economic pressure and diplomatic engagement only allowed the regime to entrench itself, to finance its operations through transnational crime, and to continue posing a grave regional security threat. And that threat was fully validated by the fraudulent 2024 election outcome, which demonstrated Maduro's absolute unwillingness to negotiate in good faith. The security threat had escalated beyond the capacity of sanctions alone to address.
And while I acknowledge the failure of the diplomatic and economic strategies to achieve a quick, verifiable result, the military option introduced a far greater magnitude of strategic risk and national instability the full consequences of which are still unfolding today. The U.S. abandoned effective, gradual, and low-risk pressure for a high-stakes, high-risk kinetic solution. We must question the long-term strategic success of this intervention, given the enduring political and military infrastructure, that ideological spine that still remains firmly in place in Caracas.
Both approaches to ending this decades-long entanglement were based on substantive positions and evidence within the material, highlighting the profound difficulty Washington faced.
They show the intractable dilemma of addressing an entrenched, ideologically opposed, and criminally implicated regime. We leave the crucial question of the strategic necessity of that final, decisive military stroke for the listener to consider.